Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. This 30-minute podcast features a new author interviewed by me every single day, 365 days a year, for about 30 minutes. I am also the publisher for Zibby Books, which publishes 12 books a year in fiction and memoir. Our books are already out now. You can check it out on zibbybooks.com. And we have a magazine called Zibby Mag, where we have lots of wonderful essays and lifestyle features. That's at zibbymag.com. We have classes at zibbyclasses.com. And I recently opened a bookstore in LA called Zibby's Bookshop at 1113 Montana Avenue at 11th Street in Santa Monica. I hope that you are able to enjoy some of our other offerings. But this here podcast is the basis of all of it and started in 2018. And no matter what I do, this is basically my favorite thing. Enjoy. Shane McCrae is the author of Pulling the Chariot of the Sun, a memoir of a kidnapping. Shane is the author of several books of poetry, including In the Language of My Captor, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the Carlos Williams Award. Sometimes I Never Suffered, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and his most recent collection, Cain Named the Animal. McCrae is the recipient of a Whiting Award, a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Award, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He teaches at Columbia University and lives in New York City. Welcome, Shane. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss your memoir, Pulling the Chariot of the Sun, a memoir of a kidnapping.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. What a powerful story. Oh my gosh, my heart just bleeds for you reading some of the things that have happened and your relationship with your grandfather and oh my gosh, all of it. Tell me about what it was like writing this book for you, when you decided you wanted to make your life into a book, and just tell me about that whole process. Please.
Sure. I think I probably first started thinking about it when I was in graduate school for the first time, getting my MFA for poetry. And so that would have been possibly 2002, more likely 2003, so about 20 years ago. And then I first started seriously writing it maybe 10 years ago, or 9 or so. But I didn't quite know what I wanted to do with the story or how to do it until maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And that's when I started writing it in earnest, maybe 3 years ago. And it was, writing it was, I was surprised to discover that there were times I enjoyed writing prose, which is unlikely for me. I generally speaking, although I like to read it, don't really like writing it. But I surprised myself. And there were times when, when I was falling asleep or just going about my day where a bit of prose would occur to me and I would have to make a note about it, which is extremely unlikely a thing for me to do.
Wow. Your poetry background shines through in basically every sentence. The way that you write, the way that the sentences are constructed, linked together, the short sections, the longer sections, it's the narrative itself is quite poetic. And yet the pain sort of seeps through in every line. Can you tell me a little bit more about, or tell listeners perhaps, the main crux of your story and how if for people who don't know anything about it, and how you were kidnapped by your grandparents and what that meant to you, and which you discuss in the book, but when you even acknowledged it was in fact a kidnapping?
Sure. Well, so my mother and father, my mother for sure, and I think my father too, were both teenagers when I was born, although if not, my father was in his very early 20s, and my mom was 18. My mother is white. My father is black. And my maternal grandparents were both racists. And when I was 3 years old, 3 years and 9 months, I just discovered this about a week ago, that's how old I was when it happened. I just thought it was 3, but I didn't have any sense of what time of year it was. So when I was 3 years old and 9 months, my grandparents, my grandfather on my father's side, so my father's dad, had just died. And my father wanted to take me. I was with him in Salem at the time, Salem, Oregon. And he wanted to take me to Phoenix, Arizona for the funeral. And my grandparents, maternal grandparents, whom my father thought were still living in Salem, my grandmother came by and asked if I could stay with them, just for a couple of days. I think overnight actually was what it was. And my father said, sure. And he let her know that, we were going to go out of town. And so my grandmother took me And it turns out they weren't living in Salem. They were living in Portland. So they took me to Portland. And so when they didn't come back and didn't bring me back the next day, my father was understandably confused. And they had gone to Portland, as I said, without telling my father where they went. My mother wouldn't tell him where they were. And sometime later, maybe it's probably just a few days, because they had to plan this all out, they took me to Texas, a suburb of Austin. And they didn't tell my father where I was, and he had no further contact. He ran into my mother. Well, my aunt, his sister, ran into my mother in Salem when I was 9. And my mother said, "Oh, I'd love for you to be in contact with Shane." And so he gave them a phone number, but it was a fake number. And so I didn't hear from him again. I found him myself when I was 16, and he had no idea where I was, but that's what happened. What it meant to me, I mean, it's hard to say, it was my life at the time, and I didn't really know that I had been kidnapped when I was a kid. Because my grandparents were really invested in me not knowing. And so, one of the things they did was they told me repeatedly my father didn't want me. Another thing that they did was they told me that what they did, they had done when I was 18 months old, not almost 4. And so my sense of reality was really undermined, but I didn't know it. So I had no idea what was going on with regard to me being kidnapped or anything like that. And I started to become aware of it probably maybe in my late teens or early 20s, but it didn't really hit me. It was a thing that a term I had used in my poetry for years, but it didn't really hit me until I was writing this book. It was really very, very recent, and I'm still not quite sure how to deal with it. So it has meant recently, it's been really sort of devastating personally, but and something I wish I could have dealt with years ago. But that's what happened.
Oh my gosh. What has been the effect of this sort of realization in the last couple of years? Like, what would have happened differently had you confronted it? Like, when you say you wish you had known years ago.
Well, insofar as I don't have a therapist, and I haven't had one for about 20 years or so, longer than that, actually, maybe 30 years almost. And so if I had really confronted it, or, even really been deeply aware of it 30 years ago, I would have had somebody, a medical professional to talk to about it. And it's not as if I cannot connect with a therapist now. I suppose I could, but I would have had, an environment, sort of ready-made for me to deal with it, talk with folks, etc. And as it is now, it's just something that it feels like I kind of need to deal with on my own, and I am trying to deal with it on my own, but I've spent a lifetime not really thinking about it. And certainly since I became conscious of it, because I think that there was, at some level, even as a child, I was aware of it. But since I became conscious of it, I've still been not really thinking about it. What it has meant is when I'm thinking about it, when I was writing the memoir, and this time, the memoir's release, it's sort of hard to do other things. Very hard to write poems, writing poems makes me extremely happy. It's very difficult to do much of anything other than, nothing. Sit around and not do things. But I'm trying to figure out how to sort of integrate an awareness of this into my life in a healthy way, so that I can live with the constant presence of this fact of the kidnapping, because, the book is a kind of manifestation of that, but also live my life in an ordinary way that, is happy.
Wow. I referenced this earlier, but just the many, many times you talked about your grandfather beating you, and it was almost like a poetic refrain, honestly, at the end of many chapters in this, and then my grandfather beated me for this, and then for this, and the dogs, and this and that. 2 things. One is, did you think about writing scenes of what that actually looked and felt like? Or was this a way of coping to sort of summarize it in that way? Like, did you think about going more in depth each time into what happened, or, you know what I mean?
Sure. Since I don't remember what it looked and felt like, I couldn't really write it. All I could do was write from the position of not remembering sort of the specific events. As I talk about in the book a little bit, or a lot, the whole book is written in such a way as to reflect this, as sort of make this a sort of felt experience for the reader. But since I was very little, I've been blocking out painful memories. Probably this started when I was kidnapped, but it's, it's hard to say. But apparently my tools for doing this, my mechanism is extremely effective. And I remember so little from my childhood. And I remember I don't remember these events with my grandfather really at all. I almost don't remember him. And so the only real way to talk about it that I could figure out was to write about not remembering it, which is what I did.
Wow. What has been the response sort of within your family about the book?
I don't know. My father read it and he seems to have thought it was a good book. My mother, I think she just got it. I don't know if she's read it yet. But those would be the concerned parties, I suppose. My grandparents are dead. So, yeah, I don't really know what they think. Other than my dad thinks it's good. I don't know what my mother thinks.
Aside from writing poetry, where else do you find joy in your life these days?
My own family, my children, my wife, Melissa. And I like playing video games and I like reading. Yeah, I would say those are the main things.
What's your go-to video game? I'm well-versed in the video game world of kids.
Well, I guess the game, I should probably say that Skyrim is my go-to video game insofar as it's the one that playing it for like 10 years or whatever, it really got me into contemporary video games because there was a lacuna where I didn't play them for years. So there's a way in which I've played that game more than I ever played any game in my entire life. And so I suppose that's the one, but I'm not playing it today. I might play it tomorrow. So I guess that would be it.
Interesting. How do you sort of come to terms with the way you were raised when you're raising your own kids? Like, do you parent with a sense of intention sort of every day? Like, how has it affected your parenting?
And I have no idea. I don't know that it would be possible to parent that way, but I suppose, like when you're parenting, at least for me, I shouldn't speak for anybody else. When I'm parenting, because I don't know what it's like for anybody else, I'm never sitting around thinking, well, my childhood was like this, so I'm going to do that. You are sort of responding to whatever it is that's going on, when it's going on. There's a way in which it's one of my, I fall back on that phrase all the time, and I don't even know if it has a lot of meaning for me. Because the sort of central events of my childhood, at least the central negative events, were so extreme, there isn't really a way for me to replicate them. At least, the kidnapping is sort of the central thing. And so thank goodness I can't imagine how that would come up. So it's not really a part of anything with regard to parenting. But I don't know. I just try to parent as well as I can and learn from my mistakes, basically.
And what types of books do you like to read? You mentioned you like reading prose, even though you prefer to write poetry. What kinds of books, or what are you reading now? What books do you love?
And I don't like reading prose that much. I used to read a lot of fiction, and I used to read a lot of nonfiction. I really prefer to read poetry. But if I'm reading, I read the Bible every day, and I do read literary criticism a good amount. And honestly, it may be that literary criticism is the prose that I'm reading these days, and I need to change that. But I'm not. Yeah, prose-wise, literary criticism and the Bible are sort of what I'm doing.
And who are some of your favorite poets?
My favorite poets are okay. Well, Sylvia Plath was the reason I started writing. And so she's sort of a permanent favorite, even though I don't necessarily read her all that much at the moment. Patricia Smith, I think, is an exciting poet. Louise Glick, for a long time, I thought of as my favorite poet of all time, that might still be the case. Robert Lowell and Jeffrey Hill are two poets who I like a lot. Sandra Lim is a poet I like a lot. Let me think. William Empson, I guess, is a poet I like a lot. It's a sort of unending list.
Okay. So what do you want readers to take away from this book? Why share your experience? What do you want all of us to know, to feel, to think?
Nothing in particular. I don't, so there's a story at the center of the book that is a sort of extreme story. And I understand that people are going to be interested in the book, many of them will be interested in it for kind of how shocking the story is. But what I was interested in when I was writing the book was the writing itself. What I care about is technique. And, it sounds maybe almost a little offensive, and I don't mean it to, but I wanted to make, to the extent that my abilities, such as they are, would allow me to do so, I wanted to make a beautiful book. And so despite what's being said in the book, despite the content, if a reader finds any part of it beautiful, that would be gratifying. But yeah, what I really cared about, the story was something that would allow me to do writing. And what I care about is the writing itself.
Well, it is absolutely beautiful. So you can. Do you have any advice for aspiring authors or poets?
I do, but it's probably the advice that they've already heard, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't hear it again, which is that they should read as much as they possibly can, and they should study. They should study poetry seriously. They should take apart poems they read. They should figure out how poets do it. They should learn meter and rhyme, even if they're not going to write meter and rhyme. They should get a real, serious knowledge of the thing that they're devoting their life to, if they're really devoting their life to it. They should be experts. So study and read.
Wonderful. Well, Shane, thank you so much. Thank you for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. What a feat, this beautiful book. Congratulations.
Thank you for having me. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.